So, hello guys, it's Alex here, and now we've arrived at the sort of rare options portion of this video series. So basically, after the starting moves of the Italian e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to c4, we know that for the most part, black plays either knight to f6, which is the move we covered second, or bishop to c5, which is the move that we spent the time in the beginning looking at. However, black also has a few different options that are a little bit more passive, or in some cases just outright bad. So the four options that we're going to look at is perhaps the most principled of the four, and the best, is bishop to e7. This is not as popular, it's known as the Hungarian Defense, but it's not as popular as, for example, bishop to c5, because the bishop on e7 is considered to be a little bit more passive. But it's still very much a playable move and deserves our attention. The other three options are, in my opinion, just dubious for black. They are the move knight to d4, which is known as the Blackburn-Schilling gambit, or the Schilling-Kostic variation or gambit, whichever name you wish to call it, is less relevant than the idea behind it, which is that it gambits this pawn on e5 here, and this is a little bit of a poison pawn. We're going to take a look at that later on. And finally, the other couple of options that we have is the so-called anti-fried liver defense, which takes the g5 square, aiming to take that away before the knight jumps to f6 to prevent all these knight g5 lines that we spent some time looking at before. And other than this, there is also the fourth option, the so-called Rousseau gambit, f5, which strikes at the center, but certainly leaves the black king very heavily weakened. So those are the four main options that we're going to look at. But for now, let's dive into the so-called Hungarian defense. The bishop comes to e7. Well, the first thing that I want to say is that most of the time, when black puts his bishop on e7, they do it after first playing knight to f6, and then when white plays a move like pawn to d3, only then placing the bishop on e7. Like this, Magnus Carlsen, the current world champion and #1, has played this quite a number of times. But to play it in the order of bishop to e7 immediately does allow white an extra and I think very strong option, which I'm going to recommend, and that is the move pawn to d4. If, on the other hand, we had arrived at it via the normal move order of knight f6, d3, and then bishop e7, in these positions, white, let's say, could castle. And in such a position as this, we're actually going to arrive at something that reminds one quite a lot of Ruy Lopez's Spanish openings. So, for example, castle in this position, let's say that black were to castle. Now we would get a move like rook to e1, rook e1. Now black plays the move pawn to d6. And white here, for example, could play a move like pawn to c3 and knight a5, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, b5, bishop c2, and c5. And after knight bd2, black could drop the knight back to c6. And these positions, for those of you who have played the Spanish with either color, you will see that the position is very, very similar to a Spanish position rather than an Italian. So this is oftentimes what the black player intends to do. He intends to take the game back into more Spanish game waters and leave many pieces on the board and hope to outplay his opponent later on, with the bishop a little bit more passive, but on the other hand, very solid position defending the king, and also the pawn with the bishop no longer on c5 or even on a7, the pawn makes a lot of sense to push and control the center. So let's go back and let's talk instead about bishop to e7 in the move order that we started off looking at. So our focus is, on the other hand, when black plays the move bishop to e7, and he does so without playing knight f6. And so the big difference, as we've seen, is that if black plays knight to f6, white goes d3 and defends the pawn. But this takes away his possibility to play d4. However, if bishop e7 happens immediately, I think white's best move is pawn to d4. Now, in this case, black rather has two options. He can either take the pawn on d4 or he can defend it with the move pawn to d6. If he takes the pawn on d4, then there is a very strong move here, which is the move pawn to c3. And white threatens to capture back with a pawn, and if black, on the other hand, captures a second pawn, then white has the move queen to d5, threatening mate on f7, and this is actually really a very big problem, because after the move knight h6, it's the only way to defend f7, white can take this knight on h6. Luckily for black, he actually has a tactical resource to not have to resign on the spot. He can play the move kingside castle, and now he is defending f7 against the mating threat, and he will capture the bishop on h6 in the next move. And if the bishop moves, let's say, to e3 or something like this, the pawn on b2 is hanging. And if the bishop, on the other hand, goes back all the way to c1 to defend, now black has the clever move knight to b4 when there's an attack on the queen and there's a threat of knight c2 check. And if white drops the queen back to d1 to protect that square, black can play c2 and fork the queen and the knight. This is all quite complicated, but the point is that it's not a case of, in this particular position here, it's not a case like after knight h6, bishop takes h6. It's not the case that black has to just straight up resign because he's lost a piece. But after the move castle here, the move bishop takes g7 does actually leave white with a better position, because white simply gives up his piece, but now plays knight takes c3, and the black king is extremely vulnerable. So this is really not so good for black at all. So therefore, we can step back. We've stepped back into this position, and we can see that taking the pawn on d4 is really not such a great idea. Perhaps the best, most solid move is pawn to d6. However, here white captures on e5, and black is once again faced with a choice of what to do. If he plays knight takes e5, this would actually be quite a big mistake, because knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and now the queen would come to h5 and create a double attack on the pawns on f7 and e5. So black would have no good answer to this, and so black should absolutely avoid this possibility. Therefore, after pawn takes e5, black's best bet is to capture back with the pawn. Now white can exchange the queens, and black shouldn't capture with the king because he would lose the pawn on f7, and shouldn't capture with the knight because he would lose the pawn on e5. So therefore, black should capture with the bishop. Now, at this point, white plays the move knight to c3, continuing his development. On the one hand, you might say that the position is quite drawish because there is symmetry in the center, and the queens have been exchanged, so maybe it will get to an endgame soon enough. But in fact, with all of the minor pieces on the board and the rooks as well, an endgame is in the distant future for now. And if we notice, black has this bishop here on d8, which is really not very well placed, and white, on the other hand, has three well-developed minor pieces. Black only has one developed minor piece for now. And so this actually really makes it a bit of a problem for black to prove equality, because he has to somehow play so precisely that he neutralizes white's initiative with this development lead. In fact, I will show one game between two strong grandmasters played in the 70s. It was between Vasyukov and Georgiou, played in 1974. And Georgiou, who was, I believe, a Romanian grandmaster, one of the very best Romanian grandmasters, the game played out as follows. He played knight to f6, Now white played bishop to e3, and he played the move castle. Perhaps a better move would be some kind of waiting, controlling move like a6, taking control of this square, and maybe preparing to develop the bishop to e7. If you play bishop e7 immediately, you may have some problems with the c7 square. However, after castle, already black was in some serious trouble. Bishop came to c5. You do not want to play bishop e7 because bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, and then in the end, this pawn on e5 will fall, a consequence of the lack of development for black. So after bishop c5, black played rook e8, but now came this knight attack on f7, knight g5. Suddenly there was no good way to defend this pawn, so Georgiou played the move bishop to e6. Now white was able to capture the bishop, winning the bishop pair, and on top of that, he gave black doubled and isolated pawns. White now, not happy with this, was not resting in his laurels, played bishop b5, pinned the knight against the rook, and after black played knight d7, he captured the knight, and after pawn takes, we have this position when white was practically winning, because we see that white has completely devastated black's pawn structure. Of course, I'm not suggesting that if you play like this with d4 against the Hungarian defense, that you're going to get this position every time, or even most of the time, or even any of the time. But it's just an illustrative game to show the dangers that lurk for black if white plays in this very simple way. He simply plays d4, he captures in the center, he exchanges the queens, and he says to his opponent, well, I have a development advantage here, I can create more threats, and black needs to be very, very precise in order to make sure that those threats don't turn into something tangible like this. In the case of this particular game, a very, very strong grandmaster was unable to deal with this white initiative. So many of your opponents, of course, if you play like this with white, will also be unable to deal with it. And I think it's a very nice and simple way to play. So hopefully you enjoyed this video and you have a better idea of how to play against the Hungarian defense. You also, if you want to play it as black, perhaps should take note that knight f6 first, inviting the move pawn to d3, and only then placing your bishop on e7. That's the better way to play it. That's the way that Carlsen plays with his bishop on e7 and plays in Hungarian defense style. So that's it from me for this video. Hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.